The Mental Health Series is brought to you by Micro Gains and Dominion Strength. Both are longtime friends and sponsors of the Barbell Logic podcast, and neither hesitated for a second in wanting to sponsor a series that they know is incredibly important to so many people. Both companies are true small businesses, American-owned, and 100% of all their products are made here in the United States. You'll hear more about that later in the show. For the finest quality fractional plates, visit microgains.com. That's with a Z, microgains with a Z.com. And for the highest quality leather belts, go to dominionstrengthtraining.com. Both use discount code LOGIC for a significant discount off their products exclusively for Barbell Logic listeners. You're listening to Barbell Logic, brought to you by Barbell Logic Online Coaching, where each week we take a systematic walk through strength training and the refining power of voluntary hardship.
Welcome to the Barbell Logic podcast. I am here with Brooke Haubenstricker, and I am Dr. David Puder, and we're going to be going through a topic on coaching lifters with depression. It's kind of an episode that targets the coach, but if you're a lifter who's ever struggled with depression, or if you want to know more about mental health or how to push through maybe or help people who have depression, I think this might be a good episode for you. So I'm a guest on this podcast. I've been here before doing some stuff. And of course, Brooke is a Barbell Logic coach. And yeah, so where do you want to start?
I think it would be good to start with talking about what is depression, because I think there can be a lot of confusion about what it is, how to identify it. So starting with the basics.
Yeah.
So depression is a lot different than sadness or grief. So a lot of people get those different things mixed up. So sadness would be a universal human emotion, right? Characterized by feelings of unhappiness, ranging from disappointment to anguish. So everybody experiences sadness from time to time, and it's perfectly normal. Grief is also a natural response to loss. So the death of a loved one or the termination of employment can cause grief. So during the grieving process, painful feelings tend to come in waves, and it can be mixed with positive feelings, but self-esteem is usually maintained during that process. Resolution, acceptance, passing of time can all improve grief, but it can also develop into depression, but that's not always the case.
Yeah. So I think about like Freud actually differentiated like depression from grief by saying that usually with grief, you have a loss of something that you know, like a person, an idea, conception of yourself. So you might grieve that loss. Whereas in depression, you often don't even know what you've lost, but you usually have lost something. And usually with depression, there's a lot more punitive self-blame or like self-criticalness. There's anhedonia. So anhedonia, loss of pleasure, like no pleasure. Sleep increased or decreased. Usually it's harder to sleep. So there's lots of that guilt, self-hatred. It's like the anger is turned on yourself. Low energy, poor concentration, poor appetite or increased appetite. I have increased appetite when I get more depressed. Some people have decreased appetite. And then sometimes there's like a psychomotor agitation or retardation. So there's this feeling of like internally slowing down or just being kind of agitated, needing to move around more. And then of course, suicidality. So, there's a spectrum. So there's like passive suicidality would be the first level maybe where people just have a thought, I wish I was dead, I wish I was alive. And then there can be like intent or thoughts about how you might kill yourself. And then there's the intent to kill yourself. So there's like maybe some planning that's going on with that intent. And then there's further planning and then, actually like carrying through with a plan. Sometimes it's impulsive, but sometimes with the melancholic, depressed person, it might be something that's planned for weeks. So yeah, depression is a horrible thing. 2 to 6% of the population suffers from depression at a given time, and it creates lots of issues. And so, it can be difficult. I imagine if you're a strength coach and you have someone who's struggling with depression, it's like, how do you help them? How do you keep moving them forward in their strength trajectory.
And sometimes it's hard to tell if somebody is depressed or not, even when you're coaching them in person, even when you see them all the time, even though we've gone over these symptoms might not always be present. So it's good to always keep an open mind and to not assume that somebody does or doesn't have depression right off the bat.
Yeah. And I think, in the strength community, in people who lift, there might be some presentations, an excessive sort of thought about their physique, what they look like, that sort of self-criticalness that comes with that. I remember watching this video of bodybuilders, and these two huge guys are standing next to each other, and they're like, yeah, I basically think about how people look at me all the time. And, I'm thinking sometimes if I don't work out, my biceps look small, or, I look weak or puny. And these guys are like these huge, huge guys. Or, women will have like thoughts that are very critical, like, I'm not beautiful, I'm ugly. And, if you're just a normal human being looking at them, you're like, no, you're not. Like, how do you even think that?
Yeah, there can be this huge disconnect between reality and how they're actually seeing the world around them. And that's not just about their body, too. It can also be about communication. You give them a compliment, they don't take it at all, or you give them a little piece of critical feedback and it just blows up in their mind, becomes this really big issue.
Yeah, critical feedback, it can be like all consuming almost. It's like, I know one person who's suffered from depression. It's like that one piece of critical feedback, they'll mow over that for not just like 10 minutes, not just a day, but like weeks and weeks,
And I had a lifter who actually was missing his workouts for a while. He ended up telling me that was one of the reasons why he wasn't doing his workouts, is because he just didn't want to read the workout feedback later, just because it seemed so intensely negative to him.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes, as someone who's being coached, I'm surprised at how positive they are, even when I don't feel positive about it. Like I can feel, it's funny, like I can get through a workout and not feel great about the workout, even though it was like, I did it, it was accomplished. I cannot feel great about it if I'm feeling a little bit more down, or if I'm feeling like a little bit more self-critical, where objectively, like, okay, I'm lifting in the 300 pounds for things. It's like, that's really strong. But in my mind, I'm not like thinking that, because I'm comparing myself maybe in my mind to other people who are much stronger than me,
Yeah.
So I think about that in a normal person. We probably all do that from time to time. But in someone who's depressed, it may be like crippling, It may like be a lot higher level of that. How do you, as an online coach, notice if someone's more depressed or burned out, or, kind of like struggling? Like, what are the things that you see in them?
Yeah, it's really tricky online because your communication is fairly limited. And a lot of times it can be mostly one way, with the coach providing feedback to the client. So it is really important that you take the time to develop a close relationship with your clients, because being able to determine if they're depressed or not, you need to be able to notice things like how they usually speak and their writing habits and their behaviors and things like that. So for instance, one of, I think, the big giveaways to me is changes in writing style or tone can also include expressions of guilt, an increase in negativity, a loss of training enthusiasm. There might also be a sudden drastic decrease in communication. They might just, they might usually write a bunch of comments after their workouts and try to bond with you. And maybe all of a sudden they just stop and you don't see any comments from them for a while. You could notice a significant decrease in training motivation. So current training goals might have little or no importance to them anymore. Increase in missed reps, particularly due to a lack of focus, tightness, or grind. Skipped exercises or workouts without an explanation. An inappropriate increase in workout length. So that might be a little bit difficult to see with online coaching, but if you're keeping track of how long a lifter's workout is taking, or if you have a feeling that maybe there's been a change in how long it's been taking, you can always ask them and keep track of that. An inappropriate increase in perceived heaviness or RPE ratings, I think that is a important one as well, especially if you're working with clients who aren't novices anymore. And then you may also notice abnormal and largely inexplicable changes to their recovery habits, so their sleeping and their eating and their stress levels.
Yep. Interestingly, in my move, I probably have a bunch of these, just because, moving and then all the stresses. And then, when you get sick, a lot of these happen as well.
Or busy.
Or just like when you get super busy, it's like, so I imagine that they're non-specific. They're not like, ruling in like, oh, this person's definitely depressed or something. But it's like the little clues.
Right. Yeah. So somebody could check off all the boxes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are depressed. It's just kind of the sign that you need to be aware that something might be going
There's
on.
also high functioning depression, in which I don't know if you've heard about this, like,
Yep.
but the people just will continue to do everything normal in life, but they just feel absolutely horrible. I know, for example, there's this like attending colleague who got very depressed. She's spoken on my podcast about her postpartum depression. And yet, if you were just looking at her performance at work, it was awesome during the time when she's like literally having suicidal thoughts from time to time. So, there is high functioning depression where people just keep grinding and going through, but they just feel horrible. And so that's one thought. Yeah, I think the barrage of negative internal critique is probably something I would check in on if you were suspicious, like, okay, why isn't this person doing it? Like, how would you then, do you jump on the phone? Do you do like a quick Zoom call with them? Like, what do you as a trainer do to sort of assess what's going on?
So I personally don't come out and just start asking people if they're depressed or not. I might ask them how they've been feeling lately. And yeah, if you can get them on a Zoom call or a phone call, that would be the most efficient way to speak with them. And then that also relays tone and stuff like that. But I found it can be difficult to get somebody who's depressed sometimes to speak with you in that way. So I usually end up having a lot of these conversations through DMs, so direct messaging.
Yeah. The other thought that I had is, in the midst of the depression or suffering from depression, if the person didn't have a coach, they probably would just stop working out.
Yeah.
Most of the people who are depressed who come and see me, they're not working out, they're not exercising, they're laying in bed, they're eating junk food, they're watching TV, they're not socializing with friends. They don't want, it's like they kind of are detaching from the world. And so I was thinking, like, one of the things that I've realized is that I just can't tell one of my patients that they need to work out. Like, that never works. Like,
it's hard to start up something like that while you are depressed.
right. And it's hard to self-start. So the best is if they have a personal coach, right? That sort of can walk with them and provide the structure. If they're severely depressed, just even having someone physically there while they're doing it actually is very, very helpful. So I think the online coach is also very helpful at keeping people going or helping people do it at all, And so,
yeah, especially when you have some sort of a relationship, because they're still having to work out by themselves, but having that accountability and knowing that there's somebody who's wanting to see how their workouts went and hear about it is really important.
Yep. I also think it must be really hard as a coach having someone missing sessions, skipping workouts, not doing the right one, kind of like halting communication, ghosting you, like that would be like really, really difficult.
It is really difficult. And I think it's hard to know how you should react in order to, improve the situation. Because a lot of the stuff that you would normally do with lifters who aren't depressed might not work. So like trying to say, hey, remember these goals you want to achieve, that they might not feel motivated to achieve those goals anymore. So it can feel kind of like you're floundering or going in circles.
Yeah, I would try to get them to say what their goals are again, That would be one of the motivational or like behavioral activation. Like, one thing that we do for depressed people is get them behaviorally activated, meaning that we have scheduled activities that give them a sense of meaning and purpose. And sometimes we say like, hey, let's do the things that gave you a sense of meaning and purpose before you got depressed. And that's going to help pull you out of the depression. So we're going to act as if you're not depressed in terms of doing the things that you used to do. We could talk a little bit about types of depression. I don't know how important that is. It gets complicated. I think it might be worth mentioning that there's some that are caused by medical conditions, like obstructive sleep apnea, would be one of them that I would put on people's radar. Like if this person snoring at night, are they fatigued all the time? Are they falling asleep while driving? Are they falling asleep while just sitting on a couch? The other medical condition that, if it's a lot of the lifters that people coach are probably like in their 50s and 60s, it's like Parkinson's disease can sometimes present with depression. But we know working out actually is the best thing that someone with Parkinson's disease could possibly do. So it keeps their dopamine going for much longer. Let me just say a couple other things here. That, substance use, of course, alcohol can worsen depression. Illicit drugs like marijuana has a higher rate of depression. Sometimes it's even more complicated because they might have PTSD, borderline personality disorder, bipolar. I'm not sure how important it would be as a coach to know like all the different aspects of each one, but just to kind of know that like there are other issues. At the same time, I don't want the coach to co-author the person that they can't do it because they're depressed. They can do it. There's just a lot more inertia to push through, and it will be highly beneficial. So I wouldn't want the coach to be like basically giving them a pass if they are depressed.
Right. So I've met people who can continue training exactly as they were before during depressive episodes. I've met people who get a little depressed and it really throws things through a loop. So it really depends on the lifter, but regardless, training is going to be beneficial for them, especially in lessening their depressive symptoms. So it's something that they should keep up as well as they can during that period.
And that kind of goes well into the training benefits. Yeah. We know from studies that, strength training really does help depression. And there's also this really cool study that showed that the people who got the strongest in this particular study had the most decrease in their depression symptoms. So there seems to be a link between the amount of strength that they gain and the decrease in depression. I would also say I've seen a lot of people who stop working out and then the depression comes after they stop working out. This happens a lot in college when, someone was a great high school athlete. They were just in a lot of team sports, and then they get to college and they have no structure to their exercise and they've never learned how to work out by themselves. They stop working out and they get depressed.
Yeah. So psychological distress like depression, self-harm, suicidal behavior are more common in sedentary populations. So it's really important to keep moving.
100%.
Absolutely. I think more recent studies are definitely showing that, resistance training or even just more intense exercises tend to have better results when it comes to lessening depressive symptoms compared to just doing really light, easy aerobic activity.
Like stretching. So these rigorous strength-oriented training programs are much better than stretching or yoga or sort of passive things, And why is that? Maybe it's because of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, testosterone will increase. So BDNF is like miracle grow for the brain. So we know that increases with exercise. You have all these like hormone systems that get regulated, just get kind of more normalized. Like we were made to be physically active, right? And so for men, testosterone will increase, confidence will increase, testosterone will increase for women as well. Of course, not excessively in a way that you wouldn't want it to, but it does a little bit. And one of my colleagues, who's an amazing cardiologist, will put older women on very, very small doses of testosterone, and it makes a huge difference for their quality of life. And so just that natural benefit of strength training, increasing testosterone just a little bit in women will make them feel a lot more confident, a lot better, less anxious. So yeah, I mean, the verdict is out, right? That strength training improves depression. Like that is unequivocal to me. That totally makes sense. And so then the more difficult thing is, okay, how do we actually help people keep going,
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that even though resistance training is shown to be the more superior or effective way of training for people who are depressed, aerobic training still does have positive outcomes. So anything is better than being sedentary, basically.
Yeah. And for a lot of people, my linear progression starts with them literally going for like a 5-minute walk every day. and then let's add 1 minute every day and then come back and tell me how it's gone, right? And that's like step one for some of my patients. Of course, my patients are a lot more like, they may like literally not be walking at all when they start, or like walking at all is like difficult.
Yeah, so you have to meet them where they're at. And a lot of working with people who are depressed is kind of this balancing act, trying to find, how can I get them to strength train or as close to that as possible, while also keeping them coming to the gym. Because strength training itself can be very difficult for some people who are depressed to complete. I see it as somebody who is depressed is already under a lot of mental stress. And we know that strength training requires a lot of mental fortitude, right? It's an additional mental stress. So for some people, that might be very difficult. So you have to be creative and sometimes modify their programming and just give them something that they can complete, even if it might not be optimal, especially in terms of their strength training progression. You sometimes have to switch the goal from strength to improving their mental health so they can return to strength training right after their episode, right? It's easier for them to be doing kind of this meh kind of training during their depressive episode and jump into strength training afterward than for them to completely be sedentary and then try jumping back into it afterward.
Yeah, it's this balance. And this is where I think a good coach can really like discern what the correct course of action is, right? It's like the best thing to do is to keep them doing something. And then beyond that, yeah, if we could get them making some gains, that would be great. I think they would feel good about that. That would help their confidence. They're exerting themselves. They're making a choice. All of those things are really important. But then, yeah, if you have to maybe make gains not as fast, or, okay, psychologically, we're hitting this limit. So we're going to down cycle things a little bit so that we can then, be doing stuff, be moving our body, but not maybe grinding PRs at the same time, So a little bit change in the priorities.
Yeah. And this is where it becomes very helpful as a coach to have a wide breadth of knowledge. So that way, how to branch out and like, okay, let's try programming this exercise in a different way, or let's try switching to this other exercise, or, making modifications like that. It does require a lot of experimenting because you won't be using the same approach for every single lifter. It's unlikely. They all need something a little bit different.
One point that you made here in the script that we're going off of is you made this point that it's not a cure. It's a piece of the puzzle in their recovery is the way that I would view it. So you're an important piece as a coach, and that's your piece. I would say getting them into psychotherapy, getting them into a doctor to make sure they don't have any ongoing medical conditions, seeing if they could get a sleep study or if that would be important. You can encourage those things, but you're not going to be providing those things, of course. And that's a good boundary as well. Like, you're not responsible for their recovery. They are responsible for their own recovery. And there's other members of the team that are going to be helping them move forward as well.
Yeah. And I think it's also important that coaches understand that. So while strength training is very effective in lessening depressive symptoms, you shouldn't promise that it's going to lessen their symptoms. You shouldn't promise it's going to reduce or eliminate episodes or disorders. These are very complex issues. So encouraging them to continue their treatment routine that they have with somebody else, like with a mental health professional, or going to seek one out if they need it, is really important. But yeah, for liability reasons, definitely don't make any promises.
Well, you could say things like, there are studies that show that exercise reduces depression.
Right, but no promises.
And so this is going to be an important part of your journey. You're not going to say things like, the only thing that you need to do is exercise. And if you do this regimen, it will be enough to get you out of depression. Like, I wouldn't say that because it's one, you can't predict the future. And two, it's kind of like, it's a little bit grandiose to think that there's like a singular key that's going to fix this issue, Yeah, that's good. Okay.
One of the first things we tell our clients they need when they start strength training is a great weightlifting belt. And Blake and Katie from Dominion Strength Training make the highest quality belts on the planet. Dominion is a wonderful small business, literally 2 people who have spent years refining their craft to personally hand make every single belt on their site as the orders come in. They aren't shipping something that they pull off a shelf, but are actually building your personal order from the raw materials, sewing the belts on these wonderful 100-year-old leather sewing machines that produce a much better stitch in the heavy leather than any of the more modern, lightweight machines. And much of the finish work, especially in finishing the edges, is done by hand. So this just gives your belt a much more aesthetic finish than feeding the belts through a machine. So for the finest quality, artisanal, handcrafted, but heavy-duty belts, all with a lifetime warranty, go to DominionStrengthTraining.com, where you can choose the Barbell Logic 4-inch leather belt or any other high-quality belt there and receive $10 off your belt order with discount code LOGIC. That's DominionStrengthTraining.com, discount code LOGIC for $10 off your belt order.
Let's go on to the third part of this.
So we haven't talked quite as much about the relationship aspect. So the relationship a coach has with their lifter is incredibly important when depression is in the picture. I've noticed that when coaching depressed clients or depressed lifters, the relationship aspect can sometimes be just as important as the coaching feedback and the programming, or sometimes even more so. So taking the time to get to know the people that you're working with and about their life outside the gym, trying to build a deeper relationship is going to make it that much easier for them to open up to you about any issues that they have with depression and being very forthcoming about, this is what I'm struggling with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in any sort of industry that you're connecting with someone one-on-one, the quality of the relationship, your ability to listen, your ability to connect with people is paramount to the success of the program that you want them to do. You know, whether you want them to continue to come to your coffee shop if you're a barista, or if you want them to continue to take medications if you're a psychiatrist or go to psychotherapy, like the connection you have with the individual is very important. And so, you know, listening, empathy, creating a safe space to give feedback to you as the coach is very, very important. You know, being like, hey, is there anything I could do to better help you? How is my feedback? How are you perceiving my feedback? Is it tough to get my feedback the way that I'm giving it to you? Is it helpful? Is it too much? Stuff like that, you know?
Yeah, trying to draw out that information is really important. Then they know they can be honest with you and they can bring up any problems or bumps in the road that they might notice.
Yep. Let's say they are depressed and they've shared stuff with you that they're depressed. How can we reinforce positive behaviors?
So whenever a lifter does something that I think is a good thing, I try to reinforce that positive behavior. So if they let me know, like I'm struggling with this right now outside of the gym, you know, I always thank them for giving me that information, for being open and honest with me. So I think that's really important to do for depressed lifters, especially because otherwise they might know how you're taking the feedback. I think saying something like thank you is a way to really say this was a good thing that you did.
You know, one thing is that like, I've really experienced a lot of positivity from Reynolds. He's my coach. Whenever he watches video of me, he always is like, oh man, great job. Like, this is great, you know? And it's like authentically, he's like happy for my progress or happy that I'm just getting after it, you know? And that's really helpful. So that positive behavior is often just doing the exercise, you know, making the attempt, even if it's like a failed attempt, like, man, you really grinded that out. You didn't quite get it, but you'll get it in the future. Like, great job trying. That positive sort of energy is actually really helpful. I've had coaches in the past who are a little bit more negative, like everything they say to you is pretty negative. And it's like, I'm not sure if that really is the best way to coach someone, you know? So,
Yeah. And as you're mentioning before, when somebody is depressed, everything feels
like everything's very critical against them, right? They feel this intense sort of internal shame, like I am bad, I've done something bad, guilt, you know, and so.
Yeah, or they'll be very critical of their own performance. You know, I've had lifters who beat themselves up because, oh, I couldn't get my back extension on the deadlift, but everything else looks great. So just by focusing on, you know, these pulls still looked awesome, I think is very helpful.
Right. Yeah. And I can even think like Matt will sometimes word it like, hey, this is awesome. This is great. If I'm going to nitpick it at all, this is what I'm going to say. But overall, it's awesome. So there's like a little bit of, there's a little bit of a comment there, And the thing is like the lifts are so technical that you could make a critical comment each time, And you could say something that's like a technical thing. And I think there's probably some sort of intuitive quality in which like what you choose to actually critique or not,
Yeah.
Do you choose
Yeah.
to critique all the parts of the lift? My wife was going through the program and she felt like it was like really hard to get the sort of constant critique,
Yeah, I've noticed that can be pretty common as well, especially for lifters who are depressed, because, already every negative comment is kind of blown up for them. So you have to have really good communication with your client to determine, okay, is this regular amount of feedback too much? Do I need to tone it down? Maybe just mention one thing every workout to work on for next time. Or I've had, in extreme cases where I just don't give technical feedback until they're in a better spot mentally because they just can't handle it. If they receive that feedback, they just won't work out.
Yep. So one of the things here, keeping the focus on the client. So listening to them probably more than talking.
Right. Yeah. So in my experience, I've dealt with depression in my past as well. When you're trying to open up with somebody about your depression and they're talking about themselves or they're talking about, their other friend who is in a similar situation or something like that, it can make it feel like maybe they're not hearing you or they're not understanding you. So I think as a coach, the more of the focus you can just keep on your client, asking them questions, trying to learn more about them and what they're going through, the better. I think if you start to bring the focus away from them, it can, sometimes feel like you're minimizing their issues or not fully hearing them.
Listening is key. So you're really like listening to what they're saying, how they're saying it, the tone of their voice, their emotions they're flashing on the face. Do people feel heard and understood, right? If a person feels heard and understood, you're probably listening well. And then looking for their own internal motivations to keep going and repeating it back to them. So that can be really important for depressed clients. Like for example, if someone wants to overcome an addiction, they're drinking too much, it's like getting them to talk about why they want to change the domains of their life that they want to improve and just saying, what I hear from you is you really want to stop drinking because, it's affecting your relationship with your kids and your wife and your job.
Yeah. So something that can be helpful when they're feeling really unmotivated in their training and they're needing to find that motivation or kind of reignite that spark is to remind them that the depression's only temporary, right? So if you completely fall off the bandwagon now, then in a few months, or however long it takes when you're feeling better, you're going to be that further away from your goals. So even if it seems less significant now, continuing to push through will improve your quality of life further down the road.
Yep, 100%. Also looking at the meanings that people have, like the meaning is, what is the purpose of working out, right? What is the purpose of pushing through even when it's uncomfortable? Working out is something that someone can choose to do. So a lot of depressed patients, they feel like the world is happening to me. I don't have any control of my surroundings. Life is miserable because of all of these environmental things that are happening at me. And how amazing is it to have something where you can do something that can improve yourself, Taking a pill is kind of like the lowest quality thing you can physically do. It's like, I'm going to put this pill inside myself. It's like it's a very small action. Going to therapy is an action. It's a bigger action, right? Going, showing up, making the appointment, talking about things that are difficult to talk about. Working out is another one of those difficult things. It's like, but it's an internal locus of control driven thing that you can do. So looking at the meaning of that, I think could be important as well. I think the final thing is like, if someone does share something that's vulnerable, thanking them for sharing and then not meeting their sharing with criticalness is probably the most important thing to do. And that's really just a life skill in general to learn. It's like, if someone shares something vulnerable with you and it's like, hey, thank you so much for sharing. Like, I actually like really appreciate knowing you more. This helps me kind of know what you're going through. And, I think that in and of itself can be very therapeutic.
Especially because a lot of the times when lifters get to a point where they're ready to tell you about their depression because they're in a depressive episode, they've already likely experienced missed workouts or really poor communications, they might be feeling really guilty about all of that. So for someone to have all of this guilt and to come to you and tell you that they're hurting, to meet that with compassion and understanding can make a world of a difference.
They're expecting criticalness from you to the same level that they feel internally. And for you to give them something else, I think is very powerful. And it just keeps the momentum going. Are there any other obstacles to training that you can think of?
So these are the main ones, but I think I'd still like to briefly go over the concept because I found it to be very important for coaching people who are depressed.
Okay.
So through coaching people who are depressed, I've noticed a lot of patterns. And one of those patterns was that there would be these obstacles to their training that would keep them from completing their training. It's important to note that these obstacles are not always related to the workout itself. So I would call those direct training obstacles. Those would be things like specific exercises, exercise intensity, failing reps, using bad technique, workout length, training-induced fatigue. So these are all things that we normally as coaches have to factor in and deal with people who are depressed or with poor recovery and stuff like that. So this means that making changes to somebody's programming does not necessarily improve their compliance because it might not be the actual obstacle that they're dealing with. So there's also this list of indirect training obstacles. These would be things like getting out of bed, getting ready to go to the gym, eating enough food to support their workouts, feeling constantly tired, apathetic, even driving to the gym, starting the workout. Another big one is not wanting to be around other people, crying or displaying standoffish behavior at the gym, and as we mentioned before, not wanting to read workout feedback later. So I've noticed as a coach, it's very important to talk to your client or your lifter about what obstacles they're experiencing to their own training, because it can vary so much. And being able to tackle these indirect obstacles is very important because those are usually the ones that they encounter first, and they can sometimes be a lot bigger of an issue than it may seem. So what I usually do is I'll ask them about their different obstacles to training. I'll give them a few examples, and they'll usually be able to tell me a few of the big ones right off the bat, but sometimes they do need to spend some time reflecting and thinking about other obstacles. So it's something that I would follow up with. So yeah.
That's good. Yeah. And I think about the obstacles, like even the way that you ask this could be like almost feel like a shaming question, right? Like, what are the things that are getting in your way of working out? It's like, well, help me understand, like, just so we can kind of look at this, like, what are some of the things that maybe get in the way of you training, And so it's how you say it, I think, is important. And then when they share it, it's like, yeah, I could see like if you were, moving and you've been sick and your gym isn't back together, it could be really hard to do your training. Is there anything I could do to help you in this, Or of course it would be hard for you to get going if you're feeling so tired and it's hard to sleep at night and all you want to do.
Yeah. And sometimes they might even seem kind of silly to you at first, like not doing a workout because you didn't eat breakfast in the morning. So being patient and trying to be understanding is really important, as well as how you word everything. And understanding the obstacles then puts you in a position where you can start problem solving with your lifter and taking down those barriers so they can actually get back to the gym. So as an example, if somebody doesn't want to read workout feedback later, could you increase positive feedback or encouragement? Would reducing the critical feedback to one item per exercise or per workout help? If they're a proficient lifter, could you temporarily eliminate critical feedback? So yeah, but it's hard to effectively help them with their compliance if you don't understand why exactly they're not being compliant, why they're not able to complete their workouts.
Yeah. I think one of the big things that I would perceive is that people would just cancel their membership if they got depressed. If like, okay, I'm just going to stop doing this. Right. So how do you...
That's actually...
Yeah, go ahead.
I actually haven't come across that too much. What usually happens is when somebody gets really depressed, they have every intention of getting back to the gym and starting up again and returning to the lifting routine that they had before, but they just have these obstacles that keep getting in the way. And then they build their own barriers by thinking, oh, I'm wasting my coach's time and they probably hate me now and stuff like that. But from the coach's end, it can actually be really tempting to say at times, like, hey, you're not working out right now. I feel bad, taking your money and not giving you any coaching. Maybe you should cancel your membership and then come back later when you're in a better place. I had that view for quite a while on training people who are depressed, but I actually had one client who said to me at one point that he feared receiving a membership termination email, as it would be kind of the sign that he hadn't been a good client despite all of his best efforts. So it's important to keep in mind as a coach that depressed lifters don't expect to be pulled away from the gym for long stretches of time. They're really trying to fight their way back under the bar. So being patient and just continuing to problem solve and figure out a training program that gets them staying physically active, even if it doesn't look conventional, is really important.
That's good. Okay. Kind of like on our last topic here.
Yeah. So normally when you're programming, you try to do as much of an MED style approach as possible. So that's minimum effective dosage, just training one variable at a time until you get something that's working for that lifter. And I think that's a helpful way to think about programming for depressed lifters, but it's often you're not able to actually do that because they'll go from being very compliant and everything's going great to doing absolutely nothing. So how do you MED from there? So instead, I have kind of these different tiers, and I like to think about programming as falling under these tiers for lifters. So basically different types of adjustments that you can make to their programming to see what's working for them, how big of a change that they need. So tier 1 would be no adjustments to programming or just secondary exercise adjustments. So these are lifters who are able to keep training through their depression. You might just need to factor in that their recovery might not be as good as it usually is, or things might feel a bit harder, but otherwise you don't really need to make any changes. Maybe just cutting down on some of the secondary exercises so they're not getting stressed quite as much. The next one would be rep and set scheme adjustments. So for instance, if doing longer sets is difficult for your lifter, they're really struggling with those last couple of reps, it's burning them out. If it's just very physically or mentally taxing for them to do really longer rep sets, you might switch from like 3 sets of 5 to 5 sets of 3. Or if the recovery's really been hit, maybe you'll just switch from 3 sets of 5 to 3 sets of 3. So reduced stress. So, not ideal for pushing forward, not as much of an MED style approach, but it reduces the stress and might make it more manageable for that lifter mentally and physically.
Yeah.
You could also prescribe a total rep prescription when the lifter's performance is inconsistent or when it's really vital that the lifter doesn't have a negative experience with an exercise. So on press, if whenever they miss, they get super, super frustrated, maybe you just program that they aim for 15 reps in as few sets as possible, stopping with 1 rep in reserve for each set. So that'll just ensure that they're pushing themselves, they're going hard, but they're not going to a place where they're having this really negative experience from this workout.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
All right. And then tier 3 would be doing weight adjustments. So if recovery or compliance is a major issue, you might need to reduce the intensity on 1 or more lifts to help them out with that. For instance, there might be some lifters who have a very difficult time like squatting very, very heavy when they're depressed. So you might do like a deload or reset their weights or introduce ascending sets or descending sets or top sets with back offs. So you have a lot of options there, but basically reducing the intensity, which can sometimes be a barrier. So as you can see, these tiers kind of move to more complexity and bigger changes to their programming. So less of what you would want to change, right? So we just had an intensity change. So that's something you typically want to avoid with a strength training. Here in tier 4, we actually have main exercise adjustments. So this is actually replacing main exercises or just removing them. So for instance, I had a lifter who had a very difficult time with deadlifts when he was depressed because his form wasn't there and they never felt right to him. And he would just skip workouts or end them early whenever he had to deadlift. So it was at a point where it was really interfering with his ability to complete his workouts. So we replaced the deadlifts with RDLs. You can also replace it with something like block deadlifts. Or if all back exercises, are giving them issues, maybe you just remove them temporarily, do extra squats or something. But it's more important that they complete workouts than they keep in all of the main exercises. I know that sounds a bit crazy, but you have to have that kind of flexibility when you're working with somebody who's depressed. And then the last tier would be complete workout changes. So obviously this would be the least ideal and kind of the last thing you would want to do, but you'd be surprised how often you kind of get tossed into this tier with depressed lifters. So this would be focusing on having them do any sort of physical activity regularly. Like Dr. Puder, you mentioned having depressed patients do walks. So I've actually prescribed like 10-minute walks 3 times a week for lifters in this category. Or maybe they like swimming, they could do some swimming, or even just, I don't know, go to the park with their kids. You just want them regularly doing something physical.
Cool. I like all of your ideas. It's very thoughtful, and I think it could be helpful, especially for the coach who's kind of considering how to program through this. There's difficulty.
And yeah, this is where the obstacles to training can be really helpful in determining what kind of programming changes you might need to play around with. And another consideration for programming is structure versus flexibility. So as strength coaches, we're used to having a lot of structure in our programming, right? We tell them what exercise to do, what sets and reps, the weight to use. So we have a lot of control. They don't have to do any thinking. And the downside to that with a depressed lifter is that you don't have any wiggle room. So you either are able to complete everything as prescribed or you don't, and it might be seen as a failure in their mind. But the flip side is if you make everything completely flexible, like you say, something like go to the gym and do whatever you want, that can leave things a bit too open. And for somebody who's already apathetic and indecisive, it might be too much for them to handle. So it's trying to find that balance between structure and flexibility. So as I mentioned before, like a good example of a mix of both of that would be prescribing a total number of reps to hit instead of a specific set and rep prescription. Or it might be say, hey, any squat variant, work up to 3x5 at something moderately heavy. That's a bit more on the flexible side, but that would be another example.
That's good. Yeah. So I think this is really good. I've enjoyed thinking about this topic with you. I think it's a really important topic just because I heard after I did my episode with Matt Reynolds on my podcast about strength training and we kind of went through some of the studies and how it helps with depression. I heard a bunch of clients came over to Barbell Logic, and it's a totally different client than maybe most of you guys are used to getting, you know? I don't know. Did you take on any of those clients that came over or people specifically who were in the middle of struggling?
No, I didn't. But I mean, if anybody's looking for a coach,
Yep.
I mean, I would be more than happy to work with more people in this population.
Yeah.
It's something that I'm passionate about. So,
yeah. And we've talked about this for a couple of years now, how your passion and kind of how you can journey in that. That's really cool. I've enjoyed thinking about this. And I think the problem that I have when I see people for psychiatry or psychotherapy in California and Florida, that's where I have my licenses. And I do coaching, like executive coaching and stuff like that. And it's like the people that I see, it's like for me, getting them to do exercise is like one of the things that's going to help them move forward. And so it's a matter of thinking about how do I actually get them, you know, under the bar, lifting weights, doing things that are uncomfortable, and it's going to help them. So I think as a strength coach, you should feel proud that like you are part of their success, or, you know, beyond just strength, right? It's going to help their brain. It's going to help their cognition. It's going to help them be more confident. It's going to help them move forward in life beyond just strength training, which I think is one thing you can get excited about. Well, cool. Well, let's leave it there. We should do another one at some time in the future. Thanks, Brooke.
I also want to mention real quick, maybe he can throw this in there, that I'm coming out with a 4-part series of articles on coaching lifters with depression. So if you enjoyed the podcast and you're looking for more information, be sure to check out those articles when they come out.
Cool. And I guess I'll just plug, if you are looking for executive coaching, if you're looking for, you know, a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, I do have some slots. These are kind of premium slots, and you would just send me a message. You can find me through psychiatrypodcast.com or the Psychiatry Psychotherapy Podcast, but the website is psychiatrypodcast.com. There's a way to reach out to me there. So yeah, good to see you and work with you on this.
Yeah, you too. So did you want to do any other podcast episodes while I have all this equipment here?
Yeah, I would say, like, what are the other topics you would want to do?
I would be interested in doing the flip side of this, which is how do you keep training if you're depressed, or if you're a depressed lifter, how do you get into this, kind of that angle? Because I think that one will get a lot of interest.
Yeah.
So some similar concepts I think will be recycled there. Like I think it'd be important to talk about the obstacles to training on their side, but a lot about like self-reflection and then, you know, how do you work with somebody else when you're depressed, things like that. Or I've been asked a lot on how do you keep eating when you're depressed or, deal with those recovery issues.
Yeah, I think that would be good. Why don't we think about that maybe for like a week or 2 weeks? I think it would also be good to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Why don't you write something up? These are great articles. I think they'll serve people well.
Good. Yeah, glad you liked it. I think it helped kind of guide the conversation.
Yep. Cool. Well, I got to run.
Yeah.
I got a patient here.
Okay.
But I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.